and part 3 of Sunnah of the Prophet. How does the book constitute its being in and for itself? We believe in it because of the stability or firmness of the text, or better, the stable nature of al-dhikr, which is the linguistic, that is, phonetic, lexical format of the book. The text dhikr, which we have in front of us today, is exactly the same dhikr that existed in the 7th century. And it is the same text that Allah revealed to Muhammad's brain, from where it was then transmitted ad verbum ipsissimus to his fellow men. The text of al-dhikr does not possess becoming or progressing. Hence, its textual format is fixed forever. On that we hear, it is truly we who have revealed al-dhikr, and we are truly its guardians. Surah al-hijr 15 verse 9. Notice that the text uses the term al-dhikr and not al-kitab, al-Quran, or al-furqan. On the non-synonymous use of all these terms against conventional tafsir, if the book possesses the equality of being in and for itself, how are human beings supposed to deal with it? How should we, being subject to becoming and progressing, read the divine text? And how should future readers whose becoming and progressing will have inevitably moved on to a more advanced level of knowledge, understand the book? We believe that readers of different historical periods will have understood different things from the text. Readers of the 8th, 9th, 12th, 18th, and 20th centuries have differed from one another in terms of their intellectual capabilities and methodologies. Some have discovered things that others have overlooked, and a third group of readers may have elicited things from the text that the other two groups have completely ignored. This is because, despite its fixed being, the book is a text of life into whose becoming and progressing the reader has been absorbed according to his own degree of becoming and progressing. This fundamental hermeneutical principle underlines our dictum that the text is fixed, but its content moves, expressing a subtle dialectical relationship between textual structure and meaning. The messages that readers receive from the text and the messages that might overlook depends on the epistemological context in which they read the text. In this regard, every reading is bound to be contemporary. A reader of the 12th century approach to the text with the scientific and social awareness of his time, his reading being the most contemporary reading possible at that time. We in the 21st century apply the scientific and intellectual level of our own age, turning our reading into the best possible contemporary reading. A reader in pre-modern times will have used the most up-to-date knowledge available to him to understand the text explanation of life on earth. He will have used the model of the 4 elements of water, earth, air, and fire, which scholars at that time employed to explain nature and life. In the modern age, however, we apply the findings of laboratory experiments that explain life as the basic transformation of hydrogen into uranium. That is, we are using an altogether different explanatory model. In both cases, the most contemporary forms of knowledge have been applied, and yet 2 different interpretations have resulted. This is because the scientific and intellectual horizon of the pre-scientific reader simply was not as advanced as ours, but which we recognize the unstoppable, relentless progress of becoming and progressing in our scientific knowledge. We now understand much better why the book is the only and ultimate source of prophethood and messengerhood, not the so-called Sunnah. It is the only text that possesses the quality of being in and for itself, and therefore the only text that is sacred. No other text by a human being, whether prophet or messenger, can ever claim to possess the same level of sacredness as the book. Since God's religion, al-Islam, can be broadly defined as ethics and moral principles, the implementation of Islam would secure a balance between humans and nature, and a responsible use of human and natural resources. A critique of the traditional understanding of the Sunnah. In this section, we refute the traditional understanding of the Sunnah, which has caused serious damage to Arabic civilizations. Because becoming has been forced to stay locked in the periods of the first 3 centuries of Islamic history. The traditional fixation of the Sunnah on the Sunnah of the Prophet has made Arab Muslim society, philosophically speaking, flat, 2-dimensional. In contrast to other more 3-dimensional civilizations, Arab Muslim society has remained backward and still displays symptoms of cultural decay and intellectual stagnation. A traditional understanding of the Sunnah forces today's jurists to make their legal decisions strictly analogous to those issued between the 7th and the 9th centuries. The traditional view has it that the Sunnah related to us the words, acts, good deeds, statements, and decisions of Muhammad, God's messenger. It requires us to emulate the example of the Prophet as rigidly as possible in our daily conduct. The following verse of al-Ahzab and 2 hadiths have often been cited to convince and discipline us. You have indeed in the Apostle of God a beautiful pattern of conduct for anyone whose hope is in God and the final day, and who engage much in the praise of God. Al-Ahzab 33, verse 21. The Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, I have left 2 things to you. As long as you hold to them, you will not go astray. These 2 things are the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Prophet. Now behold, I have been given this book together with something similar, equal. Based on the dubious notion of Muhammad's sanctity as prophet and messenger, the Sunnah, that is, the collective body of all hadiths that capture the words and deeds of a supposedly uber-human being, has gained an authority that intrudes into the daily life of every Muslim believer. General issues of religious belief and specific questions of social conduct are indiscriminately treated as equally authoritative and binding on us all. Every little detail of the Prophet's life have been defined as equally sacrosanct, whether it concerned questions of universal, objective laws, nubuwah, or legislation, risala, whether it referred to prophetic knowledge, ilm, or to legislation, ahkam shar'iyya. The hadiths of the Sunnah have thus acquired the status of sacred texts whose authority cannot any longer be questioned. As a result, the hadiths, regardless of their often dubious origins and weak chains of transmitters, were given priority to the divine text even when they contradict the verses of the book. Neither Muhammad himself nor his companions would ever have approved of such notions of sanctity. On the contrary, we hear that Muhammad explicitly forbade his followers from compiling anything but the words of God. The often heard argument that the collection of hadith enabled the Prophet's companion to better distinguish between Muhammad's word as a prophet and human being and the words of God, the divine author, and thus protect the latter from being mixed with the former, can be refuted by quoting verse 9 of Surah al-hijr that rebukes such efforts. In this verse, we are assured of the fact that Allah Himself will take care of His words as the sole and best protector of the book, and that He would not need hadith compilers to do so. We have, without doubt, sent down the message, and we will assuredly guard it from corruption. Al-hijr 15, verse 9. The truth is that after the Prophet's death in 632, his companions were preoccupied with the task of producing an authoritative collection of divine revelations. They did not bother at all about prophetic hadith. They started collecting the divine ayat under the Khalifa Abu Bakr, and then completed the task under Khalifa Uthman bin Affan, who eventually compiled the written Mus'haf, the copy we hold in our hands today. This is what has become known as the Codex of Uthman. It is said to have abrogated all other codex that existed at that time, and which were subsequently all destroyed. The Prophet's companion had realized that whatever Muhammad said or did as a human being could not have originated from a divine source, and thus was strictly related to political, historical context in which he lived. Even though they could have started to collect hadith, they continued to rely exclusively on the divine text. Knowing the book very well, they realized that to collect hadith in order to complete divine revelations would have contradicted Allah's words in verse 3 of Surah Al-Ma'idah. This day have I perfected your religion for you, completed my favor upon you, and have chosen for you al-Islam as your religion. Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, verse 3. It was clear to them that the religion of Islam was perfected even without the existence of a single hadith. It was indeed inconceivable to think that Allah has given them an incomplete religion of which half, the hadith, was still missing. And it would also be inconceivable to think that they, after having successfully collected all existing divine revelation, could have been so neglectful of not having exhaustively collected all existing hadith, a process that lasted several centuries, therefore embarrassing generations of future Muslims by having secured only half of Islam. The collections of hadith and the process of turning them into sacrosanct text is undoubtedly a later development. The following aspects have triggered this fateful turn towards the sanctification of the Prophet's Sunnah. We have identified 6 major errors which all occurred because of a wrong interpretation of a verse in the book. In dealing with these errors, we quote the first verse, highlight the mistake made, and then introduce our own reading of the text. That will be coming up next. Thank you for following part 3, and we'd like to hear your thoughts. Part 4 from Sunnah of the Prophet will follow. Thank you.